Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope you all managed to grab a tea or coffee. One of the few advantages I think of the emergence of Zoom meetings, not these online webinars, is that we don't have to spend so much time queuing to get a biscuit or to use the facilities during events. But I'd still much rather be with everyone in person, of course. Now that we're moving into the second session of the afternoon, we're going to start by repeating a little bit what we've done in the first session by looking at harvesting and processing of plant teams in the same way that we looked at the challenges around drilling and agronomy. And I'll spend probably 10 minutes or so going through again some of the results from the work we've done in DIVERSify in terms of looking to try and identify some of the solutions to those barriers, and then we'll have another panel discussion around what our panel have been trying and what they're thinking about doing in terms of overcoming harvesting and processing barriers to plant team cropping. And I think probably, as Jen touched upon earlier, we do have an agricultural system in the UK and throughout Europe that's very much evolved with monocultures over recent times. And of course, we therefore have machinery that's been developed and designed to work most efficiently within those monocultural systems. And I guess the combine is a very good example of exactly that kind of piece of machinery. It's designed to very efficiently harvest big areas of a single crop growing in a field. Although even there's potential that looking at how combines work and what they're already doing within the sort of body of the machine in some way might offer some potential for some of the challenges, particularly around harvesting, which I'll come on to shortly. And again, as I'm working through, if you have if any questions come to mind, do pop them in the chat function. We'll, as I'm talking, we'll be sort of sifting through those to generate some discussion in the panel session that follows. So this is the same slide we saw for drilling and agronomy barriers earlier on this afternoon. And as you'll probably notice on this one, the barriers that we identified for harvest were far fewer. So it's only really timing and separation. They're the two big ones that we picked up as being challenges presented to plant teams around harvest time. There were a few other barriers that we also identified, but they're really beyond the scope of the sort of workshop here today. I guess another point to take, and again, we've already seen this graph earlier on today as well, is that when we were looking at those harvest barriers and how many potential solutions might be accessible, available, or attainable to overcome them, overall, we actually found far fewer solutions when we were looking at harvesting than we did for drilling or for agronomy. So it certainly looks to be one of those areas where some of the most significant challenges may exist. When we're looking at timing, one of the most common things that came up is that, well, actually, if we're slightly worried about our 2 or 3 different members of the plant team arrangement not maturing at the same time, or some of them still being green, for example, when our cereal's ready to be harvested as potentially the main crop in that plant team, one possible solution there is to use desiccants, so to use something like glyphosate as an insurance option. I mean, you would obviously hope that if you select your plant team carefully and you potentially even separate the drilling of that plant team in time, so you might be drilling the one crop in a first pass, and particularly if you're using some sort of structured plant team arrangement, and the other crop in a second pass of the drill, you would hope that you might be able to get that spot on and just right so that the crops did mature at the same time. But of course, a lot of that's dependent on weather, and we're still, although we're much better at predicting the weather than we were, it's still a very difficult thing to do. And of course, as we see impacts of sort of climate warming, climate change, we're seeing more of these sort of strange and less predictable weather events. I can't remember the last time we had a normal year, if such a thing ever exists in terms of weather. So I think things like glyphosate, of course, that it's not available to all. It wouldn't be available to organic producers, for example, as an option. But certainly it's something that's there that could offer some level of insurance in the right type of system and the right type of cropping arrangement. And I think it's one where, again, a lot of my work, I'd probably class myself, if forced to, as an agroecologist in some ways. A lot of my work is looking at how we can develop and devise agricultural systems that are sort of more aligned to the future of production in terms of whether it's carbon or whether it's biodiversity or other water, general elements, soil health, for example. But certainly a lot of the work I do is still very reliant on having access to products like glyphosate to actually help those systems work well in the field. So the clover work I was doing it, and Jen's still doing, and Andrew's still doing at STC, for example, we actually use glyphosate there to help us check the clover so that we can get the crop in and allow it to get away faster. So not using it there for harvest, but certainly looking at it from another perspective. And I know with the with things like cover cropping as well, that glyphosate can be access to glyphosate can be quite important for farmers moving into cover crops. That's not to say that there aren't alternatives to glyphosate available, and even alternatives to desiccants, sort of potentially non-chemical desiccants, things like UV, for example. But those things are sort of potentially far, you know, at least a good few years off into the future before we can start to use those. Are very much still at the research stage, where glyphosate is something that's actually available here and now, and can, in my own opinion, can actually do a lot to help support some of those sustainable agricultural production practices, plant teams included, in terms of managing issues around crop maturity at harvest. Going back to the clover again, yes, you can probably tell Jen and I are slightly biased. But going back to the clover, the way that we don't really need to worry about issues at harvest there at all in terms of timing, because what we've done there, in a similar way that you might be able to select plant teams to deliver certain services like pest control to address some of those potential agronomy barriers, by selecting the right type of plant team here in terms of the different heights that those two members of that plant team will grow to, we overcome our harvest barriers through essentially growing a very low growing companion crop with our cereal, so that when we go to harvest the cereal, the other member of that plant team is so low to the ground that it doesn't interfere with the combine at all. And we actually deliberately selected a variety of clover, Aberpearl, because of its habit, its trait that it would stay very compact and very low to the ground, so that it wouldn't interfere when it came to harvesting the cereal crop. I suppose another potential approach to a relatively simple solution really is to looking at not timing now, but separation being a potential barrier. Is, do you really need to separate the crop at all? So potentially, if you were growing the plant team and it was maturing at the same time, could you just harvest the whole thing together as whole crop, and then look to I guess you either look to then separate that somehow post harvest, or you actually look to sell the product as a whole, and I guess that's dependent on creating markets for that sort of mixed product, markets beyond things like animal feed, for example, that might already exist but would be relatively sort of low profit. But I think potentially this is also an option if, for example, you are early on in the sort of transition to thinking about plant team cropping, might only be looking to try it in a relatively small field, for example, that you may not actually need to worry about separating that crop either at or post harvest at all. You could potentially just harvest it as a whole crop and look to use it as a whole crop without worrying about the sort of taking it on a further stage. Another one on separation, I sort of touched upon it earlier, of course, and I'll see if I can get this video to play. Fingers crossed. Doesn't seem to want to, unfortunately, this one. Anyway, never mind. Is that you could take the YouTube link there, and what the actual video clip will show you, if you were to have a look on that YouTube link later on at your leisure, is that actually the guts of the combine, which you can work out some of those here, the things that are happening inside that combine body. There's quite a lot of material separation happening there already, in terms of having various belts and things that are shaking, that are trying to separate and clean the grain as much as possible within the body of the combine. And there may be ways to, and this is something I've spoken to Andrew Manfield, who's on the panel, at some length, a very interesting conversation about whether we could actually look to try to, much as we might tweak and try to get value from things like combi drills that haven't necessarily been designed to address plant team solutions, but we may be able to use them in a way that they do. Would there be any potential to try and use the separators within combines to do a similar thing for potentially separating different grains, for example, from a mixed crop harvest? And I think this is the sort of particularly interesting area for anybody that has an interest in machinery. And I think, again, there are other things you could potentially do with that would just help and facilitate this process. Things like stripper headers, for example, that would help, that might actually sort of help assist in helping to reconfigure it or make use of the inherent ability of combines to separate anyway. But yes, again, that's I guess that's something that would need to be the subject of probably some further development and probably some a little bit further research, and probably a lot more tweaking to realize the benefits than would be required for something like a combi drill. It's also possible that, again, that you sort of don't worry too much about separation in the field itself, and it's something that, again, harvest the whole crop, as long as you've got it all matured at the same time, you've addressed that other barrier, harvest it all together. And then look to address issues with separation, either in the shed or even post farm gate, through processing, which of course is the other key theme to this part of the talk. And there are already sort of numerous pieces of kit available. This is a sort of company there that I've taken a few images from for various different approaches to seed sorting and seed separation. And this can be done by gravity, which I think is the one in the middle there. The various sort of seed cleaning type machines, seed shakers, that again are almost working in some ways a little bit like the innards of a combine harvester, which is the one on the left of the screen. And then the one you'll see on the right there is using sort of image-based technology. So sort of potentially there are options at the higher end of that type of technology where you can actually go as far as separating seed of different quality of the same type. So it could separate grain, for example, based on quality characteristics by using imaging, in much the same way as we use imaging, and we use all the different wavelengths of light to give us information about crop health from a drone, for example, or from a satellite in a field. We can do potentially similar things with machines to separate seed after harvest. I guess the main limitation with some of these is probably scale, and the scale that this might need to be done at. If you're harvesting a biggish field and you've got an awful lot of product that's coming in, mixed grains, for example, that then need to be sorted, there's probably a question there around how many of these machines might you need to process that harvest. But there's certainly some potentially quite interesting options out there, and some of the things that we can do particularly with image-based sorters are quite interesting scientifically too, in terms of being able to separate grains based on quality criteria, or based on whether you may have some that have got sort of separating them based on whether they've got disease, etc., that kind of thing. Now, although I've spoken there on the last slide about some of those being quite sort of high-end pieces of kit, there's a fantastic example from Mark Lee, who's a farmer, Green Acres Farm in England. And again, I won't try and play this video, because I don't think it doesn't look like videos are playing on this one very well. But where Mark has actually come up with a system that I believe he's put together himself in his barn to actually separate his own seed from his own mixed crop harvest. So I think he's trialing a few, and we're working with a few different plant teams. I believe it's an organic setup. And he's actually set something up there. Again, it's working on that sort of shaker system where you'll have things on grids and that will be sort of shaking and cleaning to separate. I think originally set up probably to separate things like split peas, possibly, that has been repurposed and sort of used now to separate different species within the plant team post harvest. And I would certainly recommend, if you again look at the link there at the bottom and have a look on there, you'll see the full video. There's a series of videos around the DIVERSify project, and this particular one here features a few minutes of Mark and Charlotte there from Organic Research Centre, talking about this system that Mark has set up for separating seed on his farm post-harvest in the barn. Well worth a look. Again, a bit like when we mentioned, we sort of mentioned it with clover already, in terms of timing, that timing is not an issue for our clover because the clover is just there. So as soon as the crop's ready, we can harvest the crop and not worry about what stage the clover is at. It can just carry on happily growing away. And in fact, it does. And as soon as we've harvested the crop, the clover quite often has a flush of flowers, which is obviously very beneficial. As it gets more light, very beneficial for things like pollinators. Of course, we can also separate in the field in just that same way. So this is again, this is a photo from STC, where we've got a maize crop growing with a clover understory there. And of course, we don't need to worry about separation there because we won't be bringing any of the any of the clover really in from the field at all. Right, that's all I want to say on harvesting and processing. There's, as you probably noticed, there's probably less there than we spoke about earlier in terms of agronomy and drilling. But I think that's probably something that makes this a particularly interesting area for discussion and looking at. And maybe it's possible that you've got some ideas for solutions that we haven't really thought of or come across there. So I think points for discussion here: crop maturity issues can be overcome by desiccation, but is that acceptable to all? There are certainly risks, I think, around glyphosate going forward. Like I mentioned, there may be things like big UV systems mounted on tractors for desiccation in the future, but we're a bit of a way away from that yet, I think, at least on a commercial scale. Is the challenge to separation technology time or the cost of the machinery? To separate or not to separate, is that something that's probably more market driven? I know we've got other projects being run at James Hutton at the moment, like the True project headed by Pete and Ietta, that's looking at whether we can actually look at what can we do, not just with the crops that are growing in the field, but how can we try and create markets for them, particularly for legumes, but also for, I think, for some sort of mixed crops too. And are plant teams that self-separate more attractive potentially as entry-level options? And that's certainly one of the reasons we started our journey with clover living mulches at STC. I think I just want to finish off there by showing you these. You sort of saw part of one of these earlier in the first talk, but these are actually the sort of, and again, I don't expect you to be able to read anything that's on there. You'd have to, even if you more or less glued your forehead to the screen, you still wouldn't be able to read the text. But this actually shows the complete sort of list of solutions that we've identified through our activities in the DIVERSify project to those different plant team barriers, and that's to all of them. So that's to harvesting, agronomy, drilling, and some of the other barriers that came under other as well. So I just wanted to highlight this as the sort of full set, and that it's something that you'll be able to access soon. I don't think it's actually sort of publicly available now, but it will be at some point in the not too distant future on the DIVERSify website. So that's something that's worth making a note of and keeping an eye on, so you can get the sort of full story then. Right, excellent. We shall now move into our second panel discussion. So hopefully a few of you might have sent in some questions already. If you haven't, please hop on to the chat function and send us your questions. Thank you.